We recently created a science advisory team, and some of the members are here in the meeting this morning. And Matt Segall is going to be leading our discussion this morning, and Tim Eastman is going to be responding. And a little background on Matt from his footnotes to Plato.com website. He claims to be a wisdom lover, soul maker, stargazer, and lifetime member of Team Human. By day, he's an assistant professor in the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Matt received his doctoral degree in 2016 from the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program at the California Institute of Integral Studies. His dissertation was titled Cosmo-Theanthropic Imagination in the Post-Kantian Process Philosophy of Schelling and Whitehead. So this is going to be an interesting morning this morning. It grapples with the limits to knowledge of reality imposed by Kant's transcendental form of philosophy and argues that Schelling and Whitehead's process-oriented approach described in his dissertation as a descendental form of philosophy shows the way across the Kantian threshold to renewed experiential contact with the reality. He teaches courses on German idealism and process philosophy for the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program. Matt came to our board meeting yesterday, and the comment that I remember was, when John Cobb calls, you answer the phone. So we're glad to have Matt here this morning. Also glad to have Tim Eastman with us. He's going to be responding. Tim was part of the NASA Goddard Space Center and is a consultant in plasma science, has more than 40 years of experience in research and consulting in space physics, space science, data systems, space weather, plasma applications, and the philosophy of science. The work included serving as a research scientist at Los Alamos National Lab, branch chief for the magnetospheric physics at NASA headquarters, senior research scientist and faculty at both the University of Iowa and the University of Maryland. Tim has published over 100 research papers in space physics, philosophy, and related fields. He created and maintains major websites for plasma science and applications as Plasma.org, and is lead editor of a book in philosophy of physics entitled Physics and Whitehead. So we're very pleased to have both of these gentlemen here, and I'm going to turn it over to Matt to kick it off. All yours, Matt.
Thanks, John, and good morning, everyone. Good morning if you're in California, I guess. I assume most of you are, but maybe some of you are lucky enough to not be choking on smoke. So I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to meet all of you this morning and to have been asked by John Cobb and the Cobb Institute to help launch this science committee. I am not myself a scientist. I am merely a philosopher with a deep interest in science, and I do my best to understand as many of the special sciences as I can, and to do so from a Whiteheadian point of view, where the role of philosophy would be to, as Whitehead put it, be the critic of the abstractions of the special sciences, and to try to construct a context within which all of those abstractions can hang together so that all of the different scientific disciplines, physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, sociology, etc., so that they can all more or less describe the same universe, which isn't really the case for the mainstream understanding of science, but also that all these scientific disciplines cohere with our human experience, with our spiritual and religious experience, with our aesthetic and artistic experience. So, Whitehead was a scientist and said that science is not a fairy tale. He was very insistent on that. But he also felt that modern science had committed some fallacies, like misplaced concreteness is one of the famous lines that many people who've never read Whitehead will often quote. This fallacy of misplaced concreteness. Lesser known is Whitehead's understanding of the bifurcation of nature, another fallacy where our subjective experience of the qualitative dimension of the universe is sequestered off and considered to be a mere dream, while the conjectured universe described by physics with mass and um, geometric dimensionality and so forth, things that can be quantified, is considered real. And so Whitehead tries to heal this bifurcation so we can understand science in the context of the broader field of human experience, right? So I'm excited and a bit intimidated to have Tim Eastman responding to the brief comments I want to share. John Fahey mentioned his book, Physics in Whitehead. I've studied this closely, read it several times, and now basically the whole thing is underlined, so it's hard to know what's important. But I'm going to also speak about, from a very high level, what I feel Whitehead's contributions are to contemporary physical cosmology or scientific cosmology, and I'm kind of summarizing what I lay out in this short book that I published a couple of years ago called Physics of the World Soul, Whitehead's Adventure in Cosmology. And in this text, I try to bring Whitehead into conversation with four what I would call theoretical paradigms in contemporary science: evolutionary theory, relativity and quantum theories, and complexity theory, and to show how in different ways how Whitehead was able to integrate these approaches to understanding what the universe is and how it works and where it's going and what the place of the human being is in that cosmological context. And I have to begin that endeavor to show Whitehead's relevance to contemporary science by dealing with, and I don't think Tim is guilty of this, but many physicists disparage philosophy. They think philosophy is useless. They don't see its relevance to the scientific endeavor. And so there's an obstacle right up front to get a hearing for any philosopher, much less a philosopher like Whitehead, in the scientific community, because there's a view of the history of science that suggests that science is the sort of adult phase of the development of human intelligence that's left behind childish things like metaphysics, as if once we've developed the scientific method, we no longer need metaphysics. And this is a sort of story that emerged, in the 1920s with the rise of logical positivism. And to a large extent, that movement has been critiqued and is no longer dominant. And yet there hasn't really been a full-throated rebuttal of the position and a reestablishment of a sense of the relevance of philosophy and metaphysics to the scientific project. And I think it's an important historical fact, and an unfortunate one, that just as quantum theory and relativity theory were really demolishing the old mechanistic image of nature in the first part of the 20th century, this movement of logical positivism within philosophy, I think Ludwig Wittgenstein was a important figure here in his first book, the Tractatus, kind of made it seem like philosophers should not speak about things that are beyond our factual experience of the sensory world. And he meant sensory world in the way that the empiricist tradition, going back to Hume, would imagine it, whereas Whitehead, of course, has a critique of that view of, he calls it sensationalism, right? So there's a different reading of what is most basic in our experience than the view that Wittgenstein had of just the sensory world, and that the role of the philosopher was to clarify language so it could depict that sensory world in the most accurate way, leaving questions of value and ethics and the ultimate nature of reality that might be beyond our sensory experience Leaving that aside, Wittgenstein would say, of which we cannot speak, we must remain silent. And that whole realm that he said philosophers must remain silent about, the metaphysical realm, is exactly what scientists needed help with after quantum and relativity theory destroyed the old metaphysics of mechanistic materialism. And so Whitehead's trying to, as a mathematician and a physicist who understands these revolutions in the sciences, trying to reconstruct a viable sort of metaphysical foundation for these new sciences. But not too many other philosophers or scientists were listening. And unfortunately, philosophy went in a different direction. Science became more instrumental. The mantra became, after an early phase of creativity among the founders of quantum theory, who were very philosophical, Niels Bohr and Schrödinger and Heisenberg and others. Once the mathematics of quantum theory were established, for the rest of the 20th century, the mantra was shut up and calculate. And there was this more instrumentalist understanding where it was just too metaphysical to go into what nature was actually doing and what nature must actually be like. And instead it was, we just focus on the accurate predictions that these equations provide. And so the metaphysical questions were bracketed, and yet here we are a century later, more than a century, and physicists are still struggling to integrate these two extremely successful theories and theoretical paradigms, right? Relativity theory and quantum theory. Each theory has made quite astounding predictions that have been confirmed, and yet the two theories don't cohere in any straightforward way. I mean, lots of people are working on attempts to bring relativity and quantum theory together, but so far not much progress has been made there. And in my admittedly non-specialized understanding of the contemporary scene in physical cosmology, it seems to me that that cosmology has entered what I would call an epicyclic phase of theoretical development. And so here I'm using this term, epicyclic, referring to the epicycles of the Ptolemaic geocentric model of the universe. For Ptolemaic astronomers, whenever an unexpected observation was made, the planets were in a place that they weren't expected to be based on the model, the astronomer in the Ptolemaic tradition would add an epicycle or some other sort of geometrical maneuver to save the appearances. So whenever the observation doesn't fit the model, that's okay. You just add an epicycle to the model. I see something similar happening in physical cosmology, where Einstein's equations were making all these wonderful predictions, but then observations were made, for example, of the rotational velocity of stars at the edge of galaxies. They're moving faster than one would expect if the gravitational influence of the visible matter were to be described by Einstein's equations. And so what do physicists or astrophysicists do is they invent dark matter that we can't see or detect except by the gravitational effect that we believe it must be having to cause this faster than expected velocity of stars at the edge of galaxies. Now, this, I think, is akin to adding an epicycle. Similarly, dark energy. The universe appears at its edges to be accelerating at an increasing rate, which is not what Einstein wanted. He had to fudge his original equations to prevent that, but we've observed it now. And so again, dark energy, and we're not talking about a small mathematical fudge here. Something like 96% of the universe is supposed to be dark energy and dark matter, and only 4% of the universe, in this epicyclic model of inflationary cosmology, only 4% of the universe is the matter that we know anything about. And so I think this is just how science progresses, and I'm not trying to critique the way that these new theoretical entities like dark energy and dark matter have been created to keep Einstein's equations working, to allow them to be accurate. I mean, this is how scientific paradigms work. We have a good model, and evidence arises which seems to contradict it, but we can adjust the model to fit that new evidence. But it seems to me that at some point that becomes, it kind of inverts the scientific method. I mean, usually we like to think of science as you construct a hypothesis, you experimentally test it, and that either confirms or denies the hypothesis. And on some very strict readings of what the scientific method is, relativity theory has been falsified. Now, plenty of theories can be falsified by certain observational data. It doesn't mean that you throw the theory out if you don't have anything better to replace it with. And so I'm not really trying to be critical of the amazing work that astrophysicists and cosmologists are doing. It just seems to me that at a philosophical level, we seem to be on the verge of a paradigmatic revolution that would, for example, allow quantum and relativity theories to cohere, and that would allow us to understand these anomalies, like the fact that the universe is expanding, or the fact that gravitation around black holes at the center of galaxies seems to work differently than Einstein thought. Maybe we will discover that there is such a thing as dark matter, but it's not clear how we would even be able to do that given the limits of Earth-based experimentation. So I think given this situation, and I'll be curious to hear if Tim is happy with my characterization, or if he has, if he wants to challenge it. But given this notion that cosmology seems to be in an epicyclic phase, we really do need, I think, to re-examine the philosophical basis of science. And Whitehead provides us with perhaps one of the most well-developed, coherent, consistent, adequate, and applicable metaphysical schemes that's just waiting to be taken up and applied. And so, in a lot of my research and teaching, I'm trying to do that, and I certainly need help. And so one of the things I'm excited about with regard to our science committee is that I really crave dialogue with scientists, because I want to understand the work that they're doing, so that when I go back and do my philosophical reflection upon that work, that I want to get the science right, and I want to understand it as best I can, given my limited mathematical abilities. I want to try to be of service to science as a philosopher, but also of service to the human endeavor, which, for Whitehead, cosmology wasn't just about observing and measuring and coming up with theories to describe the physical world. Cosmology is also about justifying the civilized phases of human life on planet Earth. So for Whitehead, the question is, given the values that we as human beings hold as emergent expressions of value in this universe, what must the universe itself be like? And how can we scientifically describe and understand the universe such that the emergence of human civilization, with everything that comes along with that, including science itself, is not just an anomaly, but that it makes sense that human consciousness would come out of this cosmic evolutionary process. I think the materialistic and mechanistic paradigm, which again, 20th century science actually isn't operating within a mechanistic paradigm anymore, but we still have the philosophical residue of mechanism. Many popularizers, scientists who popularize their work, still are assuming that philosophical background. But if the universe is mechanistic in the way that the quantum complexity, pre-evolutionary scientific paradigm suggested, then human beings, consciousness, even life really shouldn't exist. We shouldn't be here. And so one of the, I think, most valuable things about Whitehead's cosmological perspective is that it allows human beings to feel like it allows us to feel like we belong in this universe, and allows us to understand in a coherent way how we could emerge out of this universe. Whereas on some readings of the nature of this universe, it almost seems as though the human being, the human mind, was parachuted in to this merely mechanical world from some other realm. And these sorts of kind of supernatural explanations are not often made explicit, certainly in the mainstream scientific paradigm, but there's a way in which sometimes scientists will not understand the need to provide the condition for the possibility of the knowledge that they're claiming to have of nature. Because if nature is just this blind mechanistic process, how could it have produced an animal capable of scientific knowledge? So, Whitehead is a thinker that's trying to do justice not just to the scientific evidence, but to provide a sense of what makes science even possible in the first place. What must the universe be like such that a creature could emerge capable of doing science, right? So I want to say a few things about Whitehead's contribution to physical cosmology and how he reorients us in that context. And then I want to pause and see what Tim has to say about all this, and then I'm sure we'll have time for questions from everyone. So I think from Whitehead's point of view, he called his philosophy a philosophy of organism. And as he doesn't say this explicitly, but I think I'm being true to his approach when I say that Whitehead wants to make ecology replace physics as the most foundational science, or rather we would come to see physics as the study of the smaller organisms and the very large organisms, right? And for Whitehead, atoms are species of organism, just as stars and galaxies are species of organism. Now he's, as a metaphysician, generalizing this term organism, where usually it's used by the special science of biology, but in a self-organizing universe, Whitehead thought that it was justified to expand and generalize what we think of as an organism, so that it includes self-organizing systems at all scales of nature, not just the biological. And then what this means is that ecology, or the study of co-evolving organisms, becomes the foundational science, right? If we want to understand how hydrogen atoms emerged out of plasma, if we want to understand how stars emerged out of clouds of hydrogen, Whitehead would say we're trying to understand how organisms co-evolve, and how through events of symbiogenesis, as a biologist influenced by Whitehead, Lynn Margulis, would say, through these processes of symbiogenesis, simpler organisms form societies and give rise to more complex organisms. And that this happens across all scales of nature, and not just at the biological realm, right? So Whitehead's philosophy of organism is saying ecology is the most fundamental science, rather than physics, where we would have that normal sense of reductionism of sociology, psychology, biology, chemistry, down to the base level of physics. Whitehead's saying the most general science we can have is ecology, and all the other special sciences are examples of how ecosystems of organisms interact and relate at different scales. So that's a huge and I think exciting paradigm shift to consider. Um, and when it comes to understanding evolutionary theory, I think Whitehead argued quite forcefully and convincingly, I think, that evolutionary theory is incompatible with a standard materialistic picture of the universe. Because in such a materialistic picture where there are sort of simply located particles moving through space and colliding according to these fixed eternal laws, there's really nothing to evolve in that picture from Whitehead's point of view. And so he thinks if we're going to take evolution seriously, we really need to understand the universe in such a way that it allows for what he calls internal relationships, not just external relationships, and a universe wherein all of the stable forms of organization that emerge are historical. They emerge in the course of evolution. So, the universe didn't start with already formed particles, right? Every stable structure or form in the universe that we can observe today evolved in the course of time. The laws of physics themselves for Whitehead evolve in the course of cosmic history. So they're more like habits in that sense. For Whitehead, one of the things I'm very interested in understanding better is Whitehead's critique of Einstein's notion of curved space and his whole alternative approach to relativity theory. It seems to be very controversial, and I'm doing my best to understand all of the details without, again, having an advanced understanding of mathematics, to put it lightly. But for Whitehead, space-time, rather than being this sort of four-dimensional block, where, from Einstein's perspective, the perceptual difference that we detect between the past, the present, and the future, for Einstein, is just a stubbornly persistent illusion. And in some sense, in the Einsteinian picture of space-time, in the fourth dimension, the future already exists. And there's no room for creativity in Whitehead's sense. And so for Whitehead, rather than thinking of space-time as this actualized concrete container of some kind within which all of our activity takes place, Whitehead wants to understand space-time as an abstraction from something more concrete, which for him would be actual occasions of experience. And that for Whitehead, the simplest or most sort of primeval form of actual occasions would be, he referred to the electromagnetic society of occasions that constitute the sort of cosmic envelope or cosmic epoch within which we exist. And, we see this observationally with the cosmic microwave background radiation, right? We exist within the context, sheltered by this electromagnetic society of actual occasions of experience. And for Whitehead, the nature of that nexus of occasions has a certain topological and mereotopological structure, and it's the relationship among those occasions of experience, which is open-ended and still evolving, that constitutes the structure of space-time. And so there's a figure ground shift here that I think it's profound. I mean, Einstein's picture is hard enough to visualize, and Whitehead's asking us to, I think, ramp up our imagination to an even higher pitch in order to grasp this inversion of the sense of space-time being brought forth by occasions of experience, rather than being already sort of pre-existent and experience fits inside of it. So I'm very interested in exploring Whitehead's alternative rendering. It's almost a more general theory of relativity, you might say. And I think there's a lot of interesting areas for dialogue there between philosophers, Whiteheadian philosophers in particular, and physicists. When it comes to quantum theory, I think from Whitehead's point of view, quantum theory starts to make a lot more sense, in the sense that one way of understanding the notion of a quantum wave function would be to reintroduce some notion of potential into our understanding of nature. Modern science, up until the quantum revolution, was working within a paradigm that only acknowledged actuality, and unlike the older, ancient Greek notion of actuality in a polar relationship with potentiality, that, like, coming out of Aristotle's work, there was a sense that there's only already actualized things that have lawful relationships to each other, but there's nothing held in reserve. And certainly the standard materialistic or scientific materialist understanding would be that nature is a deterministic system, and just by knowing the position and momentum of all the actualized bits of matter at any given point, we can predict the future if we had a calculating device powerful enough. But what Whitehead is saying, and this follows from some interpretations of quantum theory, would be that what quantum theory is pointing out is that there are fields of potential, and that in every moment of, in his terms, concrescence, in quantum terms, we could talk about in every collapse of the wave function. I think Whitehead, some Whiteheadian physicists like Michael Epperson have argued that the decoherence interpretation of quantum theory is quite close to Whitehead's interpretation, that with each collapse of the wave function or each concrescence, there is a decision being made amid possibilities, and that this happens again at all scales in nature, and that it reintroduces a sense of potentiality and creativity in the becoming of nature that wasn't there in the old materialistic picture. And so, rather than I think the more extravagant interpretations of quantum theory, where like the many worlds hypothesis, for example, would suggest that all the possibilities represented in the wave function are actualized in some other universe, and all those other universes are running parallel to ours, sort of branching out with each moment. I mean, that seems, I like to think that science should be parsimonious, and to conjecture infinitely many other universes in order to explain what's going on in this universe seems to me to be the exact opposite of what we would want from a scientific explanation. And so, in Whitehead's scheme, not all those possibilities in the wave function are actualized. There's a decision made, and each actual occasion contributes itself as a result of that decision to an ongoing creative advance. I think it's a more elegant picture. And I could say more about complexity theory, but that might require another 20 minutes, and I think I've already gone on long enough, so I'd like to pause there and see what Tim has to say. So thanks for your attention, everyone.
Well, greetings, everyone. Thank you for listening in to this gathering of people with the Cobb Institute and our science advisory focus here. And my thanks to people for picking up the helm to a science effort within the Cobb Institute. I'm very pleased with many of his comments. Matt's done a wonderful job of introducing Whitehead and some of the context and history. I especially enjoyed his note or emphasis on how Whitehead's work, indeed, to some extent, the development in time, has reintroduced the importance of history, of relations, of different type of internal and external relations, of the importance of context, And then serious questions being raised about the presumptions, earlier presumptions about a mechanistic presumption of, say, 19th century metaphysics within that straight box versus a more ecological worldview, which takes full advantage of recognizing the multiple types of relationships at multiple levels. This reminds me early in my education and training. Well, when I was in a philosophy of science class, I was, a physics major, but then I enjoyed a couple of science classes, philosophy science classes, and I was taking a class from Herbert Feigl, who was one of the members of the Vienna Circle of Logical Positivism, which goes back to the mid-20s. But he was there in Minnesota in his later years, pointing out the distinction between philosophers of the something more and the philosophers of the nothing but. And well, at the time, I sort of was taking both of them seriously. I was trying to figure out, well, what's the nature of things, and who are the experts I should be listening to, and in my readings, what box does one or does that kind of make sense? Well, insofar as we have a methodology of using distinctions and reducing complex problems to more simple problems, and methodologically applying the methods, reductive methods in the science, well, one could sort of into maybe an ontological claim, not just an epistemological claim, that somehow the world itself is reductive in that ultimate sense of nothing but discrete atomic entities of the type of Democritus that are radically isolated, and that would be compatible with a radically materialist thing than disjunction, and that the orders are somehow only orders that are imposed from without, and not somehow a intrinsic historical embedded order from within. So I struggled throughout decades trying to figure out different exposures in science was to field theory and electromagnetic theory and so forth. And somewhat later, I realized that Whitehead, in his thesis work at Cambridge around 1880, he was one of the first to do a thesis on the new field theory of Maxwell. Well, it turned out ultimately that this electromagnetic field theory was profoundly successful. We use it fully today, and indeed, it became the very center point of modern physics and key to development in high-energy physics, etc. It's the implication of the interrelatedness at multiple levels that Whitehead speaks about. And yet, as we develop the theory and certain models about it, then we often kind of reimpose that classical mechanistic understanding of things. So yes, throughout the 20th century, that kind of tension between the more mechanistic model of organic or ecological framing of things was a continuing debate. And I think, I agree with Matt that I think we're in a transition now to what is going to be much more in the 21st century, a recognition that science is leading us into what by any normal construal over against some kind of mechanistic worldview, just because the latter is not up to the task of explaining various processes that we find in complex systems and evolving biological systems at multiple levels. And I think that this new understanding is that the distinction that Whitehead was clear about of geometry and physics is probably one aspect in which we need to rethink the foundations of general relativity theory. And now some recent developments suggest that some essential elements of relativity theory, instead of just forcing it into the Einstein mold, may be arising just rather generically right out of quantum field theory. And if that's the case, then then there isn't a strong separation between the quantum physics results and the gravitational component. It may, so to speak, lead us to a unified framing that ultimately is based on the field theory of Maxwell and then with Whitehead's understanding. But what I have come to realize over the years is that the science, unlike what Feynman suggested, where, well, we can radically ignore the philosophers and pay no attention to them, we can just go on and do our calculate whatever. Of course, Feynman was a great interpreter, but my view is that, and I think it's coming to be shown, that we need to listen to the philosophers. We need to be in real deep dialogue with the philosophers and the historians to recognize the interplay of these contributions to our understanding of physical systems and biological systems at multiple levels, and the history, the context, the relations, both internal and external, and these subtle distinctions. I think there's been many developments in science that have been delayed because of a lack of that recognition. One of them has to do with, say, the recognition of asymmetry versus symmetry at a fundamental level. There's one example. And now in interpretations of quantum physics is an example of this. Now, many interpreters are trying to impose a notion of actualism, where every potential alternative to quantum outcomes is somehow actualized, and actualized in multiple worlds and multiple universes they'll talk about. Well, instead of insisting upon that somehow all reality is nothing but sets of actualizations in one kind of reduction, it seems to me much more commonsensical to insist that our own experience, in which we realize that the reality of things is both a combination of the actual and the possible. That's there's a possibility for me to do something different when, even though to a great extent my actions might be constrained or almost predictable or even determined to some extent, yet there's always some residual of some possibility. And so from one's experience and from the new sciences, we realize that actualism must be flawed. That is, that the reality most fully must be both the actual and the possible. And we need to work with philosophers and historians to then come together with a new ecological framework, ecological worldview that then more fully incorporates these kinds of new understandings. And it sure sounds like, from what Matt has done, is excellent in summary to start with, that he has a great career coming forward in terms of helping us scientists to be able to take on that new understanding and to be in real dialogue. And there's also been a fault on the scientist side by failing to recognize the need for this context and history and input as part of their considerations of interpretation, which to some extent has led us down dead ends. I mean, one dead end is the multiverse's dead end, I think, and another, and the epicycles of contemporary cosmology represent, I think, another set of probable dead ends. And by listening to the philosophers and historians more attentively, I think the scientists can hopefully be a little more effective in their own work in such collaboration. And I think that's enough. We should open up to questions and answers, perhaps. Turn it back to the moderator.